let's get this thing started.
Cool.
So first, just real quick, want to hit just kind of a cover of what we'll be talking about today. Anne, you want to start us off?
Yes, I guess the whole the goal of this session sort of really came out from a result of the blog post that Daisy put up about when the different contexts got released, when we were talking about having the change from what we previously were using, and then having the options to have recommended the smoothing and the more sensitive. And then it sort of got me thinking as well, whether it's like, throughout this whole crazy year, doing a lot more training with new roasters, and really helping them better understand things like how to finish a roast, which is what we're going to talk about at the end. We're going to show a little video, showing us how to, finish a roast, what are we focusing on, and how we can use rate of rise or the rate as a predictor. And then it got me thinking about, well, what are some really great ways that we're practically using rate of rise in production? And it's kind of like, as I said to you, it's like getting a can opener and opening up the brain of us while we're, and sort of like getting out of our head all the things that we're focusing on. So I thought it'd be really great to talk about things that I experience and do, whether it's in my teaching and training, and so show some really good kind of like documents and reasons as to ways that we can use the rate of rise rate as a way to really help confirm and support us, during our roasting. So I guess it's also important to kind of frame up for everybody the context of the data that I'm presenting today. I was roasting with a 3mm K-type probe and on a Probat P12 Series 2. So just important because I'll be showing some really great, some data, and parameters and charts and everything, just in case you might look at that information and go, why can't I use that on my roaster? Because you've got a different setup. And we'll keep on reiterating that throughout the whole process. But yeah, very much an inspiration to dealing potentially with a lot of new roasters, and helping them really understand how to best use Cropster, and all the information that's ticking away on the screen. And I'm really passionate about the rate of rise rate, in particular, when I'm working with roasters. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, just for some context on that, Cropster recently released some new settings and revisions for rate of rise, so you can affect the smoothing aspect of sometimes when your curve is running, or your rate of rise is running a little jumpy, or if you have kind of a slower curve, so that was really kind of all inspired this. And Anne has been, we'll hop on real quick. Anne has been, for those of you who don't know, Anne has been a roaster for the last 13 years, and she's been in the coffee industry for 25. So she's a veteran, and she's worked at almost every level. And so there's really a lot of awesome content that she's put together with names like Rob Hoos and other big names in the industry. And so we're super, super blessed to have her sharing with us. And then I am Matthew. I am the account manager for Cropster over Australia. So if you have any questions about your Cropster account and getting the most out of that, feel free to reach out to me. And then, for all of your roast consulting needs, Anne is an amazing resource. So
thank you.
Let's dive into
yeah,
this.
let's dig into it. Yeah, so because we want to, make sure we've got enough time to get through everything. So I guess this is just an excerpt from the blog post, and sort of like starting to lay down in terms of what is rate of rise, and really, like a lot of us in the industry do talk about it being more of the rate of change, because really it's the rate at which the bean temperature is changing throughout the roast. And so one thing which we'll kind of reiterate further in is kind of realizing, for those of us that have used Cropster up until version 3, where the rate of expression and the context were actually, they used to be connected together. So whatever algorithm was being used for the rate of expression was also a reflection in the context or the line on the screen. But then RI4 came along, and then they got split apart and they were different. So then the number that's ticking underneath our bean temperature, which is the rate of expression, which we can now set to read at either, and still we can still set that to read at 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or 60 seconds. But I'm just not, some roasters may not have realized that that's now not the reflection of what's going on with the context line on the screen, which
Hmm.
is, got a different algorithm and a different way of
Yeah.
measuring. So what I'm quite passionate about more than anything is helping roasters understand the best setting for their rate of rise rate. And, and I'll be talking about using the rate of rise with 60 seconds and how we can use that as a predictor throughout the roasting
Hmm.
process. So that's why I thought, just kind of reiterating that. And it's also important to remember that if you do set your rate of rise, to 30 seconds, when you're seeing that number ticking away underneath your bean temperature, you've got to double it and, times it by 2 if you want to be thinking in degrees per minute. And I think sometimes, roasters forget that when they set that
Hmm.
rate of expression to 30 seconds, that you've still got to then, calculate and change, that value. And then in terms of then how those readings are influenced is by our setup. So just then in terms of understanding our hardware setup. So definitely understanding when do we take notice of noise? Like when do we understand the noise? When do we overcorrect? When do we not correct? All that kind of stuff. So that
Hmm.
also comes down to the kind of settings that we've got set
Yeah.
up with the roaster as well, and with the software, sorry. So in terms of, on the next slide, in terms of just understanding the hardware setup, knowing, understanding the noise is as important as knowing our roast machine. And that can change the characteristics of the ROR, and then that can affect how you interpret your ROR when you're roasting as well. So making sure that we've got, the setup done really set up appropriately.
Yeah.
Um, yep.
I was just going to say, and for all of you who are kind of wondering, what we're talking about with context and with rate of expression, we'll also talk a little bit later just about these specific settings in Cropster and, what might be the way that you want to get it set up in your own roasting account. So,
Yeah, and I
we'll
guess,
kind of
yeah.
get into these too.
Yep.
So
But it
no
also,
worries if
it does bring up the whole, there's no right or wrong. It's just, what do you feel comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
using, as long as you then, use it in the best way to help you with the roasting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then the next slide was just an example of things that will influence.
Yeah.
We've all come across these before, things that will influence our feedback, in our software. So definitely probe placement is really important. So you'll see here on the first, to the left where the cross, I've got a bean probe that's been put up too high in the drum. And then in the middle picture, I've got an exhaust probe up on the left that with the cross that has been put in the wrong spot. But the bean probe is in an ideal spot. And then things we've got to think about, when we're setting up the fidget boxes, making sure that the wires are in properly. And then, of course, probe type and size is
Mm-hmm.
definitely a big thing that we hit in the industry. And definitely with all the different design of machines and
Yeah.
manufacturers installing different size probes, thicknesses, types, all that kind of stuff. Um, you know, all of those things and many, many other things will influence then the feedback that we're getting with the software and how we're then reacting, to that feedback in our roasting. Yeah.
Exactly.
Um,
Well,
so,
even sometimes realizing that, electrical interference in your roastery can impact, the reading of your probes because it's all electricity. And so that's where, really understanding of like when your chart is jumping around,
yep.
also doing the work of looking at why is that happening. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yep. So then the next couple of slides was just a way to kind of show incorrect placement of the exhaust probe. So you can see where when the trier comes out, there's a little dip in the exhaust. So then, understanding that that's an influence from, setup. The bottom one is like a loose wire into the fidget. So this roaster was having a lot of trouble with, and I'm sure we've all seen this at some point on our screens. I know I've got to be careful with my little fidget box. If I bump something, then I'll see the lines get a bit weird on the screen. I kind of go, uh-oh, I've got to watch that and, fix it up again. So that's a pretty good example of incorrect placement and a loose wire. And then the next one was an integration issue with the P5 Series 2, where we were trying to integrate with the default probe that Probat put into their roasters, and with the probe being where it is at the or was, it's quite exciting now with the new series where they've moved the probe down lower, which is really awesome. But with this particular machine, the roaster was trying to dial in with small batches, and so with the probe being quite high, it wasn't quite, it was getting a lot of noise, from that whole process. And so, and they were also going through the thought process of, do I drill a hole and put a probe in lower, and then have a separate fidget box, to then, have the Cropster feedback on their screen. So that was really interesting. I remember talking to Lisa about this particular, roaster and how to, work through the setup with this particular probe setup. And then we've got things like different, if you are doing like profile matching across machines. So this was the research I did with Rob Poos on Can You Taste the Roasting System. And this is a classic example of, different, probes in terms of different types, thickness and placement across the machines, but you can still do the same profile. Just the feedback on the screen, as you can see, is really, really different. So the blue profile was from a Loring. The red one was from a Diedrich, and the yellow one was, and they both had, so with the Loring with the quite thin tip, the 1.5 mil tip on the probe. The Diedrich had a stock standard 3 mil probe. The yellow one was from a UG15 with a 6 mil probe. And that's why the data points are so low from that thicker probe. But technically, the coffee was tasting the same because of, as we're going to start getting into in terms of the timing and the cooking phases, were exactly the same. So yeah, in terms of sort of like, when do we misinterpret data on the screen, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So, Anne, quick question. If you just had, so obviously, there's obviously a lot of things that can change, depending on the hardware setup on your machine. When do you think is a good, what do you think is a good way to think about when should I move or replace my probe versus when should I just like learn how to read the context on my screen correctly?
That's a good question, because I'm sort of in that situation with the roaster at the moment. So on that, one of the previous pictures where the probe was in the wrong spot, they asked the exact same question. They said, well, do we move it? Do we like take it out and move it into the lower in the door? And I said, you can do that. It's just a matter of, do you want to start having lots of holes, in your roaster? So the one on the left here where I've got the cross on where the beam probe's up too high. So we're sort of in that situation of, do we move it and put it down in the door, or do we just work out how to deal with the data and the kind of feedback that we're getting? So if you go back to slide number 9, that's the kind of feedback we're currently getting. So their rate of rise line, the context actually looks like this picture here. So we're kind of working out, do we just deal with it, or do we, put another probe a bit lower? So yeah, I guess it's a bit of personal preference and kind of what, you decide what you want to work with. And look, if you do really want to have that smoother data feedback, then yes, I would 100% be moving it down lower in the door, so it's a bit more stable, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. That's I think just
that would be
what can you handle and what's going to help you roast best,
Yeah, exactly. It's when do you just draw the line and go deal with it, or do you go, nah, I've got to fix this and get it on track? Yeah.
All right. Sounds
So
good.
Sounds good. So that's kind of just giving us an idea of the things that will influence as the data is, the feedback that we're getting on the screen. What are we dealing with while we're roasting? Because that will really then influence the kind of decisions we're making while we're roasting. So, in our conversations, I've kind of said, when the manufacturers are telling us about how amazing their machines are, they've also got to remember that we're essentially buying a probe as well. And so it's really important about position, type and placement, all that kind of stuff, and thickness of those probes, because we're as roasters responding quite significantly then to the feedback. So then in terms of setup, just kind of reinforcing You know, we've now got the options of that, you know, recommended, you know, sensitive and noise smoothing, yeah, with the context, and we've got then the opportunity to change that rate of expression in terms of, you know, 60 seconds, 30 seconds, all that kind of stuff. Um, and I guess, you
Yeah.
know, what I've got here on the left and the right, with the two, you know, temperatures and rate of rise, is then what I'm going to start then talking about in terms of the kind of goals you can set for yourself with your rate of rise. So I like to then set a goal for when I get to color change. I've got a particular speed or rate in mind that I want to be moving at. So for example, I want to be at 15 degrees per minute Celsius. Sorry for those of you, I'll be talking in Celsius, but there will be some information with Fahrenheit there as
That's
well.
okay.
So I've got a goal of 15 degrees per minute by the time I get to color change. And then depending on the roast level, whether I'm doing a filter, a single origin espresso, or say a milk-based espresso where I'm going a bit deeper, then I've got a particular rate in mind by the time I get to first crack. So then knowing those different rates at different points in the roast is also going to help me design my energy management with my burners and all the other adjustments on your roaster to get you from point to point at the right time with the right rate. So this is definitely something we focus on very hard, whether I'm in consulting or in the roasting course, you know, showing people, because we get the same coffee and roast it 3 different ways, and that then brings along with it different parameters and then different thought processes in terms of what kind of rate, what kind of speed do I need to be moving at so I can achieve this particular roast level with this particular coffee, batch size, you know, machine setup, probe, all that kind of stuff.
And I'll just real quickly say this from the Cropster side, just for a few more things about like what's going on here with the settings in Cropster. So kind of with what we've been talking about, you know, previously, as it in Anne had mentioned, you know, in RI3, Cropster would base how sensitive the rate of rise was calculated by the time expression that you had set. So if you had rate of rise at 5 seconds, you know, it'd be calculating that faster and giving you
So
a
it
more
would be
sensitive rate of
really
rise.
ziggy. Yep.
Exactly. And now, and then, you know, if you had that at 60 or 30 or 15, it would base that rate of rise calculation on the time expression you had set. So
Correct.
now, just for context, with RI4, we've separated those out. So the time expression that you want to have set, you know, do you want to be telling rate of rise for every 60 seconds, you know, degrees per minute, or do you want it to be every 5 seconds, 15, 30, you know, so that you can be doing that calculation in your head. So that's now been separated from how sensitive Cropster is reading that. So
Correct.
recommended is, you know, based on RI4, which was, I think, RI3 at
With
15
15
seconds.
seconds. Yep.
And then sensitive is comparable to RI3 at 5 to 10 seconds. And smoothing setting would be RI3 at 60 seconds, 30 to 60 seconds.
Yep.
So just for context about, you know, why this is important now is you can now have that ability to be looking at time expression over how long you want. You know, do you want it really quickly? Do you want to be reading the next 5 seconds knowing where you're going to be? But then you can still have that control over the sensitivity of your rate of rise too.
Yep.
So.
And I guess for those learning roasting, I always, you know, recommend the rate of expression of 60 seconds, because I don't know about other roasters, you know, in the group, but like I want to be able to glance at my data and make a quick decision, and I use that 60-second as a predictor. I say to myself, if I don't touch anything, where will I be in a minute's time? And I'm constantly adding that rate of expression, the rate to the bean temperature, because then I know, based on my probe, that bean temperature is also connected to a physical event in the roaster. And that's when you can then start planning your phases and your cooking strategy about where do you want to get to yellow, where do you want to get to crack, and then how do you then start, you know, finishing, you know, for the end. So yeah, I really like to use it as a predictor. So if I set it to 30 seconds or less, you've got to stop and calculate, and it can get a little bit, you know, flustery when you're trying to make decisions or clean decisions while you're roasting. So that's why I recommend 60 seconds, you know, for that whole planning and you know, process while you're roasting. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, so now we're really digging into, the rate of rise and the cooking strategy and the phases. So really using rate of rise, the rate in terms of like, when you're creating a new profile, when you're planning, when you're learning, even, for consistency and repeating, your production profiles. And it's really connected to your end flavor and your overall, roadmap and approach and your timing in each phases. And so I really wanted to approach this from a really good, just keeping it real. What is the reality of what we're doing while we're roasting? And as I was, I'm saying to you in terms of, you know what, let's just talk about what we currently have. We have these probes, they're in a particular position, they're of a particular type and thickness. What are we dealing with? And then how can we use it, to our best advantage while we're roasting?
Yeah.
But it's very much about planning, about how fast we want to be moving at a particular point in the roast, so we can better design our energy strategy and our gas steps, and making sure that we're cooking the coffee properly to then get the flavors that we're after. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
So then the next slide. So this is a roaster I was working with, and so when I go to consult with the roaster, generally, obviously, the first thing I do when I start looking at their profiles, I'll kind of always look at, well, what's your setup, with your probe? What rates are you using? And then basically, what is your rate of rise at key parts in the roast? And so this just made my heart melt, because when this was a roaster trying to teach herself how to roast by using rate of rise. And so she'd kind of done a lot of the hard work already. And look, it's not an ideal profile in terms of, flavor, and there's work to do, but we can start then showing her and then adding in things like, making sure that you mark your color change in your first crack. So then we can then start mapping out the timing of the phases, and then really then work out, is she then moving at the right rate at the right point to then be cooking the coffee appropriately to then get the end flavor that she's after. So this was just amazing. When I first saw this, I was just like, oh my goodness, this is fantastic, because I can say to her, okay, recommended rate of rise for your probe and your setup, for example, 15 degrees at yellow, 8 degrees at first crack. And she's like, awesome, I know how to do that, because she's already thinking in terms of rate of rise and her energy strategy with her gas steps to get her from point to point. We just then had to add in and helping her better understand the why we need to know then why the phases are so important. And then we can then, add in the flavor aspect and then bring it all together. Then it's like, when do I look at the coffee, roasting in the roaster? And then when do I look at the software? It's like, when do I refer to each one, kind of thing, and make good decisions about the kind of profile that you're trying to create in the roaster. So then I guess then on the next slide, this is kind of like, me kind of like some situations that I come across with roasters, when always reminding them about the importance of like what I call the linear or the sequential cooking progression versus the lines on the screen. I mean, in a nutshell, it's always about, are we roasting the software or are we roasting the coffee in the roaster? It's like, so sort of back on that, when do I check in with the coffee? When do I look at the data on the screen? And then how do I make a decision about, am I moving at the right pace for this particular profile to then create the flavor that I'm after? So the picture on the left is just an example, a very common question I get asked all the time, where everything looks wonderful on the screen, but they're not making key marks on their profile like color change. And so this roaster approached me and said, look, I got the feedback that my coffee was low in body, low in sweetness. It was dry, tart, and had a bitter finish. But I don't understand, because everything looks amazing on the screen. And I said, okay, well, let's work out, where is color change happening in your profile, just so we can add that in. And then I just look at it and go, well, dude, like you're at color change at 3 minutes 45 or 44. So you're getting there really, really fast. So a typical taste result of roasting fast is dryness. So then when we start breaking down the profile into the phases for them, we can then really help them better understand that their cooking strategy was a little bit too fast, and then they were getting, trying to hold on at the back end to get what they wanted. So it could be a case of get the coffee to first crack and then develop, and kind of forgetting about the importance of everything that's going on, beforehand, all that kind of stuff. And then the one on the right is an example of potentially, you know, this is kind of my style of profile where I would do I would always be getting to yellow by 5 minutes, for example, spending about 4 minutes in Maillard, and then about a minute and a half or so on the end if I was
Hmm.
doing a nice drip roast, a nice light, you know, drip, something like that. So then
Yeah.
just with the comparison with the phases down the bottom there, you can kind of see the timing, how it's shifted and changed. And then we'll also sort of touch on towards the end in terms of, yep, I've got bumps in my line. So when do I give myself a rap on the knuckles and go, okay, that's not good? Or when do I just let go? When do I know to kind of like, when do I overcorrect and when do I not,
Hmm.
step in and correct anything? But it's just a reminder about, and I think for those of you that haven't seen, Morton at Coffee Mind did an amazing article on roast development and timing, and he's really starting to bring in the scientific backing and the reasoning about why should we be cooking the coffee for a certain amount of time because of the result in the cup. And that's what I'm really excited about, is getting more scientific backing for this timing in the phases, and the result in the cup. But that also brings along a particular rate. You know, when I'm saying I want to get to color change by 5 minutes, I've also got in mind, you know, that 15 degrees per minute for my particular probe, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of stuff where you can break down your profile into those rates, which we're going to get into definitely. So just a really good example of, well, why does that kind of pretty nice looking profile not work from a flavor perspective? And when you break it down into the phases and the cooking strategy, it helps you better realize, why it doesn't taste good from that perspective.
Just out of curiosity, what would you say is your ratio of looking at, your profiler to looking to being, aware of the beans and like looking at the machine? What do you
Yeah,
think is like a
exactly.
good balance?
So I think I was sort of saying, I might spend maybe 60 to 70% of the time with the software and 30 to 40% of the time with the roaster. So I'm being quite strategic about when I'm looking at the coffee, because I want to be mindful about things about over pulling the trier,
Hmm.
because I know on my machine, I'm the one that's got the exhaust probe on the wrong side of the hopper. So then I always get a dip in my exhaust. So I leave it there for show and tell for training. So I can tell roasters, don't put your probe on this side because this will happen in the feedback with your software. So I'm quite strategic. I know then when I want to touch the trier and then when I want to be with the software.
Mm.
Yeah, but it's a bit scary if you've got someone that's 100% on the software and they kind of forget about what's going on in the roaster. You've got to check
Mm.
in with what's going on. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So then this next decision points profile is kind of the crux of kind of where we're headed in terms of, so again, please remember this data is based on a 3mm K-type probe. And this profile is kind of my baseline for a milk-based espresso profile. So my goal, would be to get to yellow between 5 and 6 minutes, and then spend about 4 minutes in Maillard. And then I'd be spending anywhere between 3 to 3.5 minutes from first crack onwards with a specific amount of degrees in time. So this is where we're always going to tap in, kind of like one of the conclusions from Morton's article is about development time. But I'm also very passionate about also tapping in development degrees. How many degrees am I moving after first crack? Now, in order for us to be able to achieve a certain amount of degrees, we need to be also heading into first crack with a particular rate. So I guess this is what I work with on roasters, in the sense of, you can see at color change, I've got a desire to be sitting at that rate of about 14 to 15 degrees. By the time I get to first crack, I've got some options. So depending on different roast levels, whether I'm doing a slightly darker milk-based espresso, a slightly lighter espresso
Mm.
roast single origin, which I would also class as a really nice drip roast as well. And then with my filter, I would class that more as a pour over, just for clarification, if, for people kind of wondering, well, what's the difference between filter and drip, all that kind of stuff. So then I've got a particular rate in mind at which I need to head into first crack with, because I'm also then moving a certain amount of degrees in a certain amount of time after first crack as well. So the video that we're going to see in a moment is my milk-based ending. It's the last 3.5 minutes of the roast. And I'm going to talk about how I'm using rate of rise as a way to plan, how do I finish a roast? Because for a new roaster, that's potentially the most terrifying part of roasting, is everything's cracking, everything's happening, and you're going, how do I finish this? What do I look at? How can I use it as, what can I use as a guide? And yes, we've got the ratio percentage and the timer ticking away, but we can really use the rate of rise rate to our advantage 100%.
Hmm.
You know, as a way to help us finish a roast. So this is just a guide in terms of what I would use with my different rates at different points in the
Hmm.
roast. That's then helping me better design my gas steps or my energy strategy. And also in relation to batch size as well. Like, how do I want to move, you know, a particular coffee, a batch size, all that kind of stuff.
And I think something that we had just talked about earlier that I think was good to mention, is these are rules that you have set for your machine and your probe type
And
and,
my flavor preference.
and
Yep.
your flavor preference. And, that's where, figuring out for each individual roaster on your Hasgaranti, on your Diedrich, on your Geest, and what are the
Yep.
rate of rises that I like, for my filter, and setting those rules for yourself so that when you're, on the production floor and you can just, know that like, okay, I'm roasting my filter,
Yep.
I'm in development. Oh, I'm like above my rule.
Yep. And dare I say, and I know we're all doing it, like there'll be a point where we need to walk away from the roaster because we'll be stickering bags, we'll be filling buckets, we'll be doing all sorts of stuff. We want to be able to look over at the screen, see the temperature that we're at and see the rate that we're sitting at, as well as the line, the context line as well. And we can make good decisions by glancing at that data and kind of know, oh man, I've got to step in and overcorrect, or I've got to back off and let it go,
Mm,
all that kind of stuff. We're all
yeah.
going through weather changes at the moment too. And our profiles are all slightly shifting based on the environmental conditions settling into different seasons as well. So definitely our gas adjustments are going to be changing. However, the rate shouldn't change because we're trying to keep them in check. Accordingly. So just on the
Exactly.
next slide is just a bit more of a simpler version of that decision page, where you can kind of give yourself some nice rules about, a particular temperature at a particular time with a particular rate. And then with the desired kind of, end color that also matches an end flavor as well.
Hmm.
So this is the kind of, really way you can just strip everything back and make it really simple in terms of how you can use your rate. So then in terms of then, ways that I define those rates for myself is, doing things like a daily roast log. So in Cropster, when you're doing your highlighting or your daily roasts, then you can do a roast compare, and then you see all the data, like, comparing along each other. You can do that. I prefer to do something like a roast log sheet where it's got a summary of all of my key events. And then I start to see patterns. And then I can keep myself in check. So this is all milk-based espresso roasting again. So this is a session, a roasting session. And I'm keeping myself in check and making sure that I'm staying in that, 14 to 15 degrees after first crack, 3 to 3.5 minutes. I've got a rule of 3:45 to 4 minutes in Maillard, 5.5 minutes for yellow, all that kind of stuff. And then there's a rate of rise rate connected to that data as well. And then, in your production cuppings, you highlight your favorite profile, and then you start to create parameters for yourself. Which is what the next table is all about. And so those roasters that have worked with me before will then see, we create this parameters chart based on your flavor preference and your probe. Super important. I'm so sorry for those of you that have thicker probes. So if you do have a 6 mil probe, a lot of your data will be a little bit lower and a little bit different. But this is an example of what I would do for my preferences in defining the difference between a sample, a filter, and an espresso roast. And it's particularly in terms of degrees and time to also go along with the development ratio percentage. So you've got to give yourself some better clarification, especially for the end of the roast. So this is all about end roast definition, this chart. How do I
Hmm.
define, how do I finish for a filter or an espresso or single origin, all that kind of stuff.
And just to highlight, if you would like to create something like this for yourself, Ann Cooper is available for consulting. You should 100% reach out to her, and she has
Yeah,
worked with a ton of
absolutely.
people.
And the only way this chart was created was by doing a truckload of roast log sheets, and then a lot of production cupping, and then a lot of highlighting, and then summarizing all of your favorite roasts in terms of what profile it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can say, well, here is my parameters in defining my different roasting styles.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
so
just
this is definitely something you can
importance of
do for
having good
yourself.
data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, kind of where we're headed is the video, which is next. Because I'm just sort of being
Exactly.
mindful of time. So we've got, we can. So this is just the last 3.5 minutes of my production roast for a milk-based espresso. So I'll try my best to keep up with the video. So basically what we're seeing is we're going to see, can you just hit pause for a moment, Matt? And I'll just do a
Sure.
quick little,
Can
cool.
do.
So, so the idea with this video, just for a bit of context in the sense of, the rate of expression is set to 60 seconds. Now I'm heading into first crack, which is going to be happening around like 202, kind of in 202-ish in that zone. So at this point, I'm really focusing on the rate of expression, the number underneath. Sorry, I just lost my screen. Hang on. There we go. That's okay. All good. Yep, it's all good. So I'm really focusing on the rate, yep, underneath the temperature there. So then I'm saying to myself, I'm managing my heat, my energy strategy, my burner settings to maintain that 8-degree rise rate as I head into first crack. Now you'll also see underneath, we're going to quickly touch on the exhaust rate of rise underneath as well. So I'm always keeping an eye on every time there's a peak in that exhaust rate of rise as well. That's giving me an indication on how to manage the heat as well, which we're going to talk about after the video. So yep, so hit play, and I'll try and we'll keep up with the video here. So you'll see, and this is where just stop it there for a moment. See how, whoops, went back. But anyway, as you see the rate of rise kicking up and when it goes down, I'm also keeping an eye on the context line. So when there's a kick in the bean, in that rate of rise, if it's going up and the exhaust is going down, I know not to touch anything and let it go. But we'll sort of watch that as we progress through the roast. So I'm going to be marking first crack pretty much around now would be good. So you can see I've got my 8-degree rate of rise. So it was about a 202.7 temperature. So this is where I say to myself, I'm doing a milk-based profile. I want to get 15 degrees from that 202. So then I plant the end point of a temperature, of an end temperature. So then I say to myself, my end temperature is going to be 217. And I want to achieve that in 3 to 3.5 minutes. So now what I'm doing, so as the bean temperature is increasing, I'm then adding that rate of rise expression, that 6 degrees to the bean temperature. So I'm saying to myself at the moment, I can really only make it to 213. So if I start going down on the gas right now, I'm gonna lose energy in the roaster and I'm not gonna make it. Now, another thing I also do at this point, see how there was a really big kick in the rate of rise of the exhaust? I always ignore the first kick after first crack, and I don't react to that. So at the moment, it's on its way down. So see over here, by the time we get to 210, I've only got about 4 degrees on the rate of rise. So it's telling me I can get to 214, but I've got a kick in the energy here. So then I went down another 5% on the gas. Now just hit pause there. Yep. So if you sort of go, if we don't do it now, but if we did go back a couple of seconds, see how there was a pretty decent kick in the bean rate of rise, but the energy on the exhaust was on its way down. That's a really good example of where I would not overcorrect. So if you see a kick like that happening, but the energy on the exhaust is going down, that's when I just back off and go, no, I know that it's going to, the bean context will sort itself out and get itself back on track. And then I wait for then the next kick in the exhaust to then plan my next gas adjustment, as well as watching the bean temperature increasing and the rate of rise declining. So then I start adding the two together. And then when I start getting as close as possible to 217, it really starts then helping me better design my gas steps so I can reach that 217 in the right time. There is also the thought process of using the development ratio percentage. You know, you might want to make an adjustment at 10% and then 12% and then, you know, sort of as at different times. The only thought process with that is that you might have the wrong rate of rise at that, you know, percentage. So it is best to think in terms of time and degrees and have an end goal. So then you know how to better manage your gas steps and backing your way out of the roast. Yeah, so we better hit play and finish this, the last minute and a half. So you'll see I'm just indicating here, I'm constantly adding. So I've got almost, you know, by the time I get to 212, I know I can make it now to 216 because I've got 4 degrees to use up and, you know, 212, but I can see a kick happening over here. So I'm now getting ready to think about going down another 5% on the gas. So every time, and now that's just based on trial and error as well, knowing how much to go down by with your heat adjustment. So I'm basically just going down on the heat and maintaining the ability for my bean temperature to increase and then my rate of rise to keep on decreasing. So this is another good example of the bean just slightly kicking up, but then the rate of rise on the exhaust is going down. So I know that that will rectify itself. If I had have overcorrected that, I would have lost that 4 degrees and then all of a sudden I end up with 2 degrees and I can't finish the roast with enough energy. So see, again, I'm indicating now I can get to 219. I've got plenty of juice to use up now for the rest of the roast. So now as there's a kick in the exhaust, I'm then going down on the gas again, and then you'll see the energy going down, declining. I've got plenty of energy now to get to my 217, endpoint. And then I'm pretty much going to end up, you know, on these bigger batches on about a 1% gas because I've got plenty of rise rate or rate to use while my bean temperature is increasing. So I'll sit on a 1% and then I just cruise out and I pull out pretty much pretty soon. So should be now. Yep. So I'm constantly adding that rate of rise to my bean temperature. So that's just a picture of the profile, so you can see what it looks like, you know, as a whole there. So I'm really using that rate of rise, that rate of expression, and I'm constantly adding it to the bean temperature to let me know how I can plan. But you have to plant the seed of an endpoint temperature first, and that's based on a lot of tasting and a lot of, you know, experimenting, and me saying my goal for my milk-based espresso is 15 degrees after first crack in about 3 to 3.5 minutes. And then that then helps you to design your gas steps to then achieve that, and you use your rate of rise as a way to also help you map that out towards the end of the roast as well.
Yeah, just want to say, you know, we're coming up at
Yep.
at 250 right now. But we've still got a little more things to talk about. But as you guys are thinking of questions, you know, make sure to kick that in the chat. And at the once we reach the end, we'll be able to chat about some of those. The one thing I wanted to ask you, you know, what is that the rate of exhaust? You know, we were talking about those kicks. That's like really telling, you know, what you know, the energy that's coming out of your roaster. So when that's kicking, like, what does that mean for you when you're thinking about, you know, as you see the rate of rise of your exhaust coming up? What does that kick look like?
Up. So then that's an indication for me to then start that's a sign to then make an energy change, basically.
Yeah.
So it basically means that I've got to start reducing the energy in the roaster. So then that energy will then start going back down again, and it will then keep the energy and the rate of rise in check as well. So, I mean, the ultimate goal is to have your rate of rise hitting a maximum peak in the beginning, and then steadily obviously declining for the rest of the roast. And
Yeah.
so a way to then do
Yeah.
that obviously is then starting with maximum energy and then gradually declining as you go along.
Yeah.
So, and just using that rate of rise as a really good speedo, like a gauge, which is, quite good. But just in terms of helping you to work out how to finish the roast, if you've got a goal in terms of how many degrees over what amount of time do you want to be moving, it can really help you then plant an endpoint. So then you can just focus on managing your energy steps to then get to your endpoint in the
Yeah.
right way. Yeah.
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 Awesome.
Yeah, and then just the last slide was just that example
Mm-hmm.
of, ways that I've used. So you'll see on the right picture where every time there's a peak in the exhaust, I'm then making an adjustment to the heat. And that allows me to then keep the energy in the roaster in check. Everything's declining quite nicely. But I'm also really using the rate of rise, so that would have been for me, a very typical profile where I've got 15 degrees at color change. This was a filter profile, I believe, so I would have been sitting at about
Mm-hmm.
maybe 6 degrees by the time I got to first crack. But really using those energy kicks in the exhaust to also help. So when I'm on unfamiliar equipment, I'm glued to the rate of rise of the exhaust as a way to sort of help me manage the energy in that roaster. And then we've just got to work out the appropriate energy steps to use to then help us manage the energy in the
Mm.
roaster a lot more appropriately.
I
Yep.
think a phrase you used that I really kind of loved was the idea of driving the roast. And the rate of rise of exhaust, kind of telling you how much energy, is like going on with your gas and all that. And so
Mm.
I think everything you said was just super great, especially because there's not a lot of people talking about the rate of rise of exhaust and how that impacts. So I
Yeah, but I'm
think it's really
100% sure
interesting.
though roasters are, referring to that in
Yeah.
some way or form. And I guess what we're talking about as well, and even like that video as well, and that's very much, I know that's the kind of stuff that roasters are internally thinking about, and whether we've had the opportunity to actually express that. There's nothing wrong with sort of saying, hey, you know what, I use degrees and time after first crack as a way to plan the end of my roast, because I know that end temperature is also relevant to a color, and the timing, the balancing of the energy, the end part of that cooking
Yeah.
is then finalizing everything I want to achieve in my end flavors, providing
Mm-hmm.
you've done everything else appropriately beforehand as well. Did you get to color change at the right time with the right rate? And did you get to first crack at the right time with the right rate? And then just reinforcing then, the phases and that cooking strategy.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with, you use whatever you need to use to help you work, in the best way. And I'm just, really, I was really quite excited in terms of identifying with best ways to use Cropster and really best ways to use things like the rate of expression. Keep it simple, keep it to 60 seconds, and use it as a predictor. How can I plan where I want to be at a certain time in the roast with a particular rate?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have
Whew.
reached the end of this
Yeah,
webinar. The good thing
so that was
is
a lot to cover in an hour. That
oh,
could have been
I
like a
know.
whole day session.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out
Hmm.
and ask further questions and
Yeah.
whatnot. So yeah.
Well, the cool thing is we have a couple questions already, and we have some time, so feel free to share some more. But the first one that we had was, how do you approach ROR? Like, is it important when using electric roasters? So, how do you find any
Oh,
differences there, and how do you approach it?
that's a cracking question, because I was on an electric roaster a couple of weeks ago. Because you've got to work quite hard with electric roasters. You've got to work hard to get the energy in, and you've got to work, I reckon, 3 times as hard to get the energy out. Because just working with the way that the coils, take on them and, get the heat out of them. I mean,
Hmm.
I would say yes. I mean, if you can try your best, I think that would be, using the rate of rise would be an amazing way to help you plan your strategy with how you're adjusting the heat in the electric coils. Yeah, because the rate is all about heat management. It's helping you better design your energy strategy, basically.
Hmm.
And that's the only reason why gas steps or energy steps get created, is because you want to be somewhere at a certain time. You want something to happen at a certain time. You then assign a temperature, specific to your probe, your machine, and your setup. So that's when
Yeah.
you then can use that little bit of that connect the dots approach, because you know that a temperature is connected to a physical event. You then just drive from point to point,
Yeah.
because then it's going to cook the coffee then, in the way
Hmm.
that you want it to. So I would say, yeah, I think it would be an amazing help on electric roasters.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So then the second question, and I think this is really good. Just talking about when trying to avoid, crashes and flicks, what difference is there in the final cup between a smooth curve from the start with the gas setting always going down and the same smooth curve with many gas adjustments going up and down? So if I understand that correctly, with, avoiding crash and flicks, is it better, like, what do you think is going to be the biggest differences between a constantly descending gas and then, kind of doing that work of always, changing
This is
to meet
where
your
brings
RoR?
up a couple of things. I would want to know what roaster they're using, like what system. So for example, if you're on a loring and if you're driving it in profile recipe mode, then we all know that it's constantly zipping itself up and down because it's chasing the profile in the background. Um, but I would always remind myself about the cooking strategy, about the way that the heat is being transferred to then take the beans through the physical change. And this is where I would definitely bring up that thought process of, are you roasting the software or are you roasting the coffee in the roaster? So I would always try and frame myself up ideally to have declining energy. Ideally not being in a situation where I have to, be turning the heat up and down depending on the system. So some systems you can get away with it, like, definitely with, your lorings, or even like with Probat, and the premix kind of burner and the double skin drum. I'd be a bit nervous doing an up and down routine on a thinner drum, stuff like that. So
Hmm.
I would think about it from the cooking strategy side of things. Yeah.
So do you think that
But
that
I
would
would
be really identifiable in the cup, if you're doing those many gas changes versus constantly descending?
Potentially, yes, because it would influence the rate at which you're moving as well. But yeah, I mean, look, yeah, it's a very good question in the sense of what you're seeing on the screen versus, it
Hmm.
could look, a little bit ugly on the screen, but it might taste really good. And that does
Mm.
happen a lot. You're going to have a bit of an ugly looking curve or ugly looking, data. But again, it's because you've taken the beans through the right stages, through the right timing, in
Mm.
terms of their cooking. Yeah.
Yar. So good. Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, and it is 2:59, so we're doing great on time. Wow. As feel free to reach out to us. Anne has years of consulting experience, so feel free to reach out to her. She has a ton of knowledge and can help you, really identify um, uh, identify how to really dial in your roasting system. And then if you want to get more information on Cropster and how to get the most out of your profiler, feel free to reach out to me. It's Matthew@cropster.com and then Anne at eqmr.com.au.
Yeah, I just realized that
Um,
I made a spelling mistake on my own.
ah,
That should be eqmr .com.au. Sorry about that. It's a
e-
bit
I,
embarrassing.
ah, ooh, dang.
So I've got
Um,
EWMR, sorry, eqmr.com.au. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, do you have time for one more question? I've got
Yep.
an interesting one that sounds worth
Awesome.
exploring. So the last question for today is, how important is the rate of rise of the exhaust and inlet temps? So we talked a little bit about exhaust, but also thinking about inlet temps.
Yep.
Um, and then a little bit more general, when roasting naturals, having some charred parchment along the is having some charred parchment along the center line typical? That might be a consulting
Yeah,
question,
that's
but
definitely a consulting question. That's not sort of relevant to this session.
but with inlet
But
temps, what do you think
yeah,
about
the
that?
inlet temps. So that's also machine specific as well. So
Hmm.
definitely, when you're on things like a Diedrich, those kind of machines, that those temperature readouts are quite important. So yeah, definitely use them in every possible way to sort of support the way that you're managing the energy in the roaster. So
Hmm.
yeah, 100%. If it helps you strengthen your steps and your decisions, then yeah, absolutely, add it in 100%.
Exactly.
But I would personally probably say exhaust for me is something that I would probably focus a bit
Hmm.
more on. That's just
Yeah.
me personally. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
thank you, Anne. We
yeah.
appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone for
Pleasure.
coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And
thank you for everyone for taking the time. Really appreciate it, and
yeah,
thank you to Cropster again. I really appreciate the opportunity to, have a voice in the industry and helpfully just be out there supporting roasters and just helping them be the best at what they're doing and just supporting everybody with good information and yeah, just keep on being amazing.
sounds good to me. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your Thursday and a great weekend.
Yes.
All right, see ya.
See ya.